today is titled African Refugees in Israel, the Plight of Non-Jews in the Zionist State. And I will just say that about this topic, that one of the reasons why we thought this was so important to highlight is not simply because of the urgent human rights imperative that is involved with this particular issue, but also because of the important parallels that can be drawn between the experiences of this community and the experiences of Palestinians as they both relate to the policies of the Israeli state. And joining us to talk about this topic today is David Sheen. He's an independent journalist and filmmaker, originally from Toronto, Canada. He now lives in Dimona, and he's been blogging when he first moved to Israel in 1999 and later went on to work as a reporter and editor at the Israeli daily Haaretz. He's currently writing a book about African immigrants to Israel and the struggles that they face. And David has been one of the most, if not the most outspoken advocate and cataloger of the plight of African refugees in Israel. So it's a pleasure to have him here today and welcome him to talk about this topic. So, David.
If you will, a dystopic United States of America. One slightly different from the one you're living in currently, in which the director of the largest hospital in Philadelphia announces that he regrets that Jews are having babies and bans Jews from entering the hospital unless it's an emergency, in which the largest preacher in Palm Beach County organizes preachers across the nation to issue a religious edict banning Christians from renting apartments to Jews, in which Philadelphia City Councilor proposes that there be new municipal bus lines only for Jews because they smell and spread diseases, in which Brooklyn City Councilor evicts Jews from their apartments in the middle of the winter, in which the mayor of Charlotte simply rounds all the Jews in town onto buses and kicks them out of town, in which the mayor of Sacramento puts flags up all around the city and declares that the city is now at war with Jewish people, in which Jews living in Los Angeles are cordoned to just one specific section of town, a ghetto for Jews only, and in which the head of the Department of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, announces that why can't Jews just accept that the United States is a Christian nation, calling them disease bearers, and saying that he will make their lives miserable until they leave. In which Attorney General Eric Holder revises the legal status of Jews, and henceforth they can be arrested and prosecuted and jailed, even without having the right to a fair trial. Now, everything I've just described to you, of course, is fictitious. But this is exactly the situation in Israel. Of course, I'm talking about these sister cities. So it's not in Philadelphia, but in its sister city of Tel Aviv, where the director of the largest hospital said that he complained that Africans were having babies and banned Africans from entering the hospital unless it's an emergency. And not Palm Beach County, but its sister city of Tzfat, where the chief rabbi organized all the chief rabbis around the country to issue a religious edict banning Jews from renting apartments to Africans and other non-Jews. Not Philadelphia, again, but Tel Aviv, where a city councilor proposed that there be separate bus lines for Africans because they smell and spread diseases. And not Brooklyn, but Bnei Brak, where the mayor actually kicked up Africans out of their apartments in the middle of the winter. And not Charlotte, but in Hadera, where the mayor rounded up the Africans and kicked them out of town. And not Sacramento, but in Ashkelon, where they were cordoned to a separate section of town and only allowed to live in that area. And not in Los Angeles, but in Eilat, where flags were hung all over town, and the mayor declared that because they have now reached 10% of the population, that the city was now at war with Africans. And not the Department of Homeland Security, but Israel's corollary, the Interior Minister, Eli Shai, who announced that Africans were disease bearers and that he was going to make their lives miserable until they leave the country. And not Attorney General Eric Holder, but Attorney General of Israel, Yehuda Weinstein, who implemented policies which essentially strip Africans of their legal right to trial, and they can now just be accused of a crime, and that's enough to have them carted off to jail. To understand how far back you have to go in American history to reach a similar state of affairs, you would actually have to return to 1850, when Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, under which any white person could accuse any black person of actually being his property, even if this is in a northern state, in Michigan or anywhere else, and that black man or woman was not even able to present any evidence in her favor or his favor that she or he was a free person. And just the accusation alone was enough to have them carted off, taken down to the south. And that's the situation in Israel today. And I'll explain just one quick example of how this would manifest, and does manifest on a daily basis. So, African person biking down the street, confronted by the police. Excuse me, that bicycle you're riding, is it yours? Yes, this is my bicycle. Okay, prove it. What do you mean prove it? Well, do you have a receipt for that bicycle? Can you prove that you purchased that bicycle? No, I don't usually carry around receipts from the bike I bought 6 months ago. Well, I'm sorry, then you're under suspicion of stealing that bicycle. You're going to have to come with me, take you to jail. That's the level of the legal status of African asylum seekers in Israel today. No recourse to the courts. To make it plain, I'm not speaking about the Africans who were airlifted by the Israeli government in the late 80s and 90s. I'm not speaking about the Africans who serve in the army, or the Africans who serve in the Knesset, or the Africans who win beauty pageants in Israel. To be precise, I'm not speaking about African Jews or Jewish Africans, or as they're often referred to, Ethiopian Israelis. To be sure, Ethiopian Israelis and other Jews of color do experience racism in Israel. White supremacy is a problem everywhere in the world, including in Israel, and including here in the United States of America, where people with less pigment believe they have more privilege, and people with more pigment often have less privileges. And of course, other systems of oppression are also at play in Israel, like nativism, where people who immigrated less recently believe they have more privileges than people who immigrated more recently. And of course, classism, where people who have accrued more stuff believe they should have more privileges than people who have accrued less stuff. But on top of this, in Israel, you have the added layer of oppression of Jewish supremacy, where people who are Jewish or more Jewish, however one would define that, have more privileges in the state of Israel than people who are not Jewish or people who are less Jewish, so-called. I'll give you an example of how all these systems of oppression intersect. So this newspaper that was published in Haaretz, I'll just read it quickly. In the corners of the living quarters of the Africans, you will find the filth, card games played for money, residents getting drunk, and prostitution. The Africans bring this way of life with them when they migrate, and it's no wonder that crime in the country is on the upswing. Young women and even young men are again not safe going out on the streets alone after dark. Now, this text could easily be published in an Israeli newspaper nowadays talking about these African asylum seekers. But in fact, this text was published in 1949. It wasn't published about these Africans who've only just recently arrived. It was published about these Africans, Jewish Africans from Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt. North African Jews who migrated to Israel. As I said, the experience of nativism, of people who further back in time immigrated to the country, believing that they have more rights and privileges than people who only most recently immigrated. It's almost a long-standing tradition, this idea of resenting new immigrants and resenting people who are poorer than those who've arrived further back. But this specific wave of immigration of non-Jewish Africans, the racism against them, I mean, let's just say that the racism against Jews pales in comparison to the racism against non-Jewish people of color. So you can understand what I'm talking about. Let's focus on a map so you can see who the characters are in this drama. This is, of course, us here in North America. Northeast Africa is where we're going to zoom in. And here's the names of the countries. We're going to remove some of them, just focus on the main actors and zoom in. So refugees from Sudan started migrating to Libya, hoping through Libya to reach Europe. And for many years they did. But then European governments cut a deal with Gaddafi, agreeing that they would purchase more oil from him if he would agree to police his maritime borders and prevent Africans from reaching Europe. And so once he did that and that migration route was cut off, then there was an influx of Sudanese refugees heading towards Egypt. After a few years, they then continued on to Israel, and a couple years after that, refugees from Eritrea also followed the same migration route. Many people ask me, why wouldn't they just stop in Egypt? Why would these asylum seekers not end their journey there? Why would they continue on to Israel? And the reason why is because in the middle of the last decade, you had a protest by African refugees, Sudanese refugees in Cairo and in front of the UN office, demanding that they receive the refugee rights they were entitled to. Egyptian police just came in and started beating and shooting people, and they killed dozens of men and women and children. And ever since that day, African refugees have not felt safe in Egypt. And that's when the migration towards Israel began, crossing the desert in order to reach what they were told was a democratic country. So they arrive in Israel, and sure enough, within short order, as I described earlier, when they only constituted a few dozen in the city of Khadera, even that was too much. And the mayor had the police round up the Africans in town, stick them onto buses, and dump them off in another city. And just so that you don't think that this is some kind of marginal extremist, this mayor of Khadera, Chaim Avitan, who kicked out all the Africans, is embraced by Benjamin Netanyahu, and they campaign together because they work in lockstep, hand in hand. These policies became the policies of the new Netanyahu government once he was elected in 2009. With Netanyahu rising to the top office in the country, first move is to appoint Eli Yishai, then the head of the openly Jewish supremacist Shas party, to the position of interior minister, which in Israel holds a lot of power, including the power to determine whether people are allowed to enter or exit the country. And just so you understand what the Shas party is, their spiritual leader in 2010 openly declared that all non-Jewish people were created by God for the sole purpose of serving Jewish people. They are donkeys intended to serve their masters. So this is the spiritual guidance of this party. And put in the position of deciding who enters the party, first thing that Eli Yishai does is take away from the UN the right to determine who can be considered a refugee and who won't, and he takes that power to the government itself. Now, they invited this man, Joel Moss, who's an Orthodox Jew from Canada, and he'd spent decades working with the Canadian government at implementing its own refugee policy. And after working there, he saw that Israel was dealing with its first ever wave of non-Jewish asylum seekers, and he wanted to contribute to the state of Israel. As an Orthodox Jew, he felt connected to the country, and with his vast experience, he wanted to help Israel implement and create an infrastructure for dealing with potential refugees. And after he'd been on the job and trained a staff of people to take on this task, he said that we the United Nations and the US Department of Homeland Security, we trained Israeli officers to the highest international standards. But the system is basically carved out to reject claims. The state is doing just about everything it can to not implement the spirit of the Geneva Convention. Instead of judging claims effectively, it is deterring refugees from coming or staying here. So, the Africans themselves claim that they have come to the country because they are fleeing ethnic cleansing and they're fleeing political persecution. I don't need to tell you about Sudan. I'm sure you've heard enough stories of the ethnic cleansings that have gone on there. Without going into too many details, the next largest portion of these African asylum seekers are from Eritrea, and Eritrea in its entire history has never held a national election. So you can imagine the kinds of political persecution that goes on there without going into too much detail. I just want to warn you, if you're queasy in any way, if you're sensitive, you might want to look away. I'm going to show some very sensitive images you may prefer not to see. On their way to Israel, many of these asylum seekers are kidnapped by gangs of human traffickers, and then they are held in torture camps for weeks and months. Their relatives are called on mobile phones. They are tortured while they're on the phones with their relatives so that their relatives can hear this, be haunted by it, and agree to pay ransom through shady money networks. And in addition to the conventional torture methods of beatings and rapes and gang rapes and electrocutions, they've also patented a new method of torture specific to the Sinai, where they take plastic bags and they burn them, and then they drip the plastic onto people's bodies. And every news organization from CNN to Al Jazeera has already documented this. Another common claim is, why don't these other countries, why don't you speak about them? Why don't they accept refugees? And the truth is that 80% of the refugees in the world are living in so-called developing nations. It's the poorest people of the world who are taking on the burden of sheltering most of the world's refugees. And in Israel's own neighborhood, you have countries taking in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of refugees. This isn't even updated. If it would be the most recent numbers, you would see Lebanon not with 500,000, but upwards of several million Syrian refugees. And if we compare Israel to the countries that it wishes or aspires to be among, you'd see that, again, Eritreans, who make up something like 60% of the asylum seekers in Israel, receive 90% in the United States refugee acceptance rate. In some countries it's more. Even in France it's still over 50%. In Israel the acceptance rate is 0. So you can see Israel actually leads the world in having the lowest acceptance rate of refugees. And that's by looking at the amount of asylum seekers in the country. In Israel there are approximately 55,000 asylum seekers in the country, and comparing it to the amount of people that have actually received status. I think last year they actually accepted one African refugee. It happened to be a white person, an albino. Not that they didn't deserve refugee status, I'm sure they did, but it says something when the only African you accept for refugee status is a non-black African. So the people themselves, of course, say we are escaping persecution, we are fleeing persecution, but according to the government, they are all liars. The government says that they are all just seeking a better life, hoping to work and make money, and after a few years retire off of this, these this capital that they have accrued, and return to their countries of origin. So, starting with the new Netanyahu government, you have the formation of immigration police who conduct sweeps in Tel Aviv and, demand people's papers and send them off to jail, the idea of getting them out of city centers. And soon after, you have incitement, where again, as I alluded to earlier, you have dozens of rabbis across Tel Aviv signing these religious edicts, informing Jews that they must cease from renting apartments to non-Jews. And then it takes off on a national scale, and you have hundreds of chief rabbis across the country, and they're instructing their constituents to not rent apartments to Africans and Arabs. And the sickest part of all is when you actually read the Hebrew tract where they instruct people not to rent Africans, the justification they give for this is referencing chapter verse of the Bible where there are calls for ethnic cleansing. Based on these calls for ethnic cleansing, of killing off these other people in the land, that's the reason you should not rent apartments to any non-Jewish people. It's a sick logic. And understand, I actually support free speech and believe everyone should have the right to say what they want, but these aren't just random people. These are chief rabbis who are on the public payroll. It's my tax money that goes to pay these people's salaries. And as you can see, they are paid quite handsomely. And this is what they do with those salaries. They incite racism. And so then you have, in the city of Eilat, flags throughout the city, red flags to denote we are at war with the Africans, and signs throughout the city. We are all defending our home. The residents of Eilat are putting an end to infiltration. And you have these mass rallies, headed often by members of Knesset, like Michael Ben-Ari, where you have gangs of people roaming through the streets in areas where there are large concentrations of Africans, and screaming and yelling at them, "Get the hell out of the country!" And these are some still shots of these anti-African rallies that I've documented. You may want to, at a later date, check out my website, because then you can see the video. I've taken the time to subtitle them so you can hear what people are saying and you can get the full effect. It's one thing to hear adults, and it's another thing altogether to hear 5-6-year-old kids saying, "Yeah, Daddy, we got to kick out the N-word." It's soul-shaking. If you go to these demonstrations, you'll hear that the discourse on the street is often around miscegenation, or rather anti-miscegenation, the drive to prevent people from so-called different races or religions or ethnic groups from entering into romantic relationships. And so you see the poster reading Bnot Yisrael le'am Yisrael, or Jewish women for Jewish people. Basically, get your hands off our women. This is a common refrain at these anti-African rallies. It's a big reason that people don't want non-Jewish Africans in the country, because they don't want their daughters to be tempted by the virile African man, booga booga, this concept of the oversexed African. This crazy stereotype is actually, very, very commonly held and underlying a lot of this anti-African racism, I believe. And it pans out when you listen to people on the street and ask them what motivates their racism. It's often this fear that somehow the Jewish genes will be infiltrated by, African people, and they're trying to prevent that from happening. And so the end result is that the government does not allow African people to work in the country. It allows them in because it doesn't want to outright deport them. If it outright deports them, it'll just look so horrible on the world stage and be so scandalous. So it allows these asylum seekers into the country, but the goal is to make their lives miserable, as per the quote of the Interior Minister, hoping that without means of sustaining themselves, without the right to work and earn a living, they'll just eventually give up and try to find some other way, in some other place. And so often they're working in dead-end jobs and making less than minimum wage without any protections and easily exploitable by their employers. And if they aren't even able to find that meager income, then they're not living 10 people in a room, then they're crashing in some kind of bomb shelter or sleeping in the park, even in the cold, in the winter, even in the rain. And then, in addition to the top-down racism from the government and religious officials, and in addition to the grassroots, bottom-up community organizations that, you know, organize these anti-African rallies, then you have the civil society joining in, and even soup kitchens from Tel Aviv to Eilat begin banning Africans, saying we will only serve food to Jews. We're not going to be serving Africans anymore. So the weakest segments of society aren't even serviced by soup kitchens. And thankfully, a few good-hearted Israelis started up, in response to this, a soup kitchen that specifically works out of South Tel Aviv Park, where a large number of African people make their ad hoc community center. And so, at least that, but the government's efforts, you know, ramp up, and in January 2012, the government passes the Anti-Infiltration Law. And it easily passes, and it's on the basis of this law that Africans are essentially criminalized. And at this point, what I described earlier is anyone can be arrested for any crime. All of those follow from this law, which essentially places them in a different legal category. Interestingly, this law actually wasn't a law, it was an amendment to a previous law originally legislated in 1953, which was originally passed in order to criminalize Palestinians, who themselves had fled the fighting in 47-48, and now returning to their homes and villages and families and communities and orchards and fields. The government wanted to prevent them because it wanted to have as few non-Jewish people in the country as possible. And so it passed the law in 1953 to prevent Palestinians and criminalize them and label them as terrorists. And so now this old law was being resuscitated in order to apply to African asylum seekers. So as soon as it passes this law, I was asked by an African NGO in Tel Aviv to author a report about all this racism, government-sponsored racism, and I did so, and the UN responded by agreeing with what I'd written and, you know, telling the government that it had to strike down this law that it had passed that discriminates against African asylum seekers, and demanding that it condemn these political and religious leaders and their racist statements. But the government did no such thing. And the next month, you have Israelis firebombing African people's homes. You have, in a single night, 7 African families, their homes were firebombed, including an African kindergarten. If you can imagine that. Didn't make it to the American media, did it? I'm going to come back to this story. Of course, there are Israelis who are incensed and outraged by this insane racism. And right after the firebombing, there were people who went out into the street to that very spot and screamed and yelled and protested and demanded an end to the racism. But these Israelis are not only marginalized, but vilified and called traitors. So there is a huge these people are so delegitimized that they have to really think twice and 3 times before they take a stand, because they know that by merely expressing solidarity with African asylum seekers and opposing and the idea that they have to be driven out of the country, they themselves become targets of racist hatred, and that can take the form of people wishing death upon them and wishing rape upon them, and that's quite common. And if you think it's bad what the men have to hear, you don't want to hear what the women who advocate for Africans have to listen to. Some of the most horrible curses that you can imagine. And after the firebombing, basically every other night there's another anti-African march or rally, or an African man stabbed, or an African man shot, and this goes on for a month. And then at the end of May 23, 2012, you have a full-on anti-African race riot, a pogrom. So she's wearing a homemade t-shirt that reads, "Death to the Sudanese." Again, it's led by that same then member of Knesset, Michael Ben Ari, and he whips people up. But it's not just him. there were several members of Knesset from the ruling Likud party who also spoke at this demonstration in South Tel Aviv, including famously Miri Regev, who called Africans a cancer. And responding to this, people got stirred up, and then they just went on a rampage, and they ran through the streets of, like 1,000 people ran through the streets of Tel Aviv, attacking any dark-skinned person they saw, running up to buses. Are there any African people on this bus? Get them out. Let's get them. Smashing vehicles that any African was driving in. This woman, they bashed her on the head from behind with a beer bottle and threw her kid to the ground. Of course, any African-operated cafe or restaurant ransacked, smashed, and looted. You'd think that in response to this horrific night of violence that people would look in the mirror and reflect and, realize that maybe we've overstepped our bounds and we have to, take account of what we've done. There was no such accounting. You had the most bewildering sight in the days that followed, with Africans marching to the United Nations, pleading with the United Nations, please defend us, we are under attack. We are humans, not cancer. And it wasn't just that one member of Knesset who called Africans cancer. In the week that followed the race riot, a survey was conducted in which it turns out that over half of Israeli Jews agreed with her comment that Africans are cancer. And a full 33%, a third of Israeli Jews, supported the violent vigilante attacks like those that had occurred that night. Incidentally, I should point out that member of Knesset did apologize for calling Africans cancer. But she actually apologized not to Africans for comparing them to cancer. She apologized to cancer victims for comparing them to Africans. So also in the days that follow, you have leading rabbis from Bnei Brak issuing another religious edict, and this one defines any Israelis who come to the aid of Africans as a rodef. And a rodef, according to Jewish theology, is the designation that they gave to Yitzhak Rabin. If you remember, the Israeli prime minister who was assassinated, in the weeks and months leading up to his assassination, right-wing rabbis issued this edict, which classified him as a rodef, meaning that he is an evil man, he's a pursuer, and therefore any Jew may murder him and be free of the consequences. There will be no repercussions if anyone out there decides to kill this man. And in fact, that's exactly what happened to Yitzhak Rabin. On the basis of this religious edict, an Orthodox Jewish man went out and assassinated the prime minister. So now you have the same designation being given by these Israeli rabbis, again, paid for by my tax money, the same designation given to any Israelis who come to the aid of Africans. This is following the pogrom. Also following in the same week, you had that same attorney general issuing a ruling on the book Torah HaMelech, the King's Torah. Now, just briefly, this book is essentially a Gentile murdering manual. It's written by two crazy right-wing rabbis who deliberate on under what circumstances is it permissible to murder a non-Jew, even a non-Jewish child, even a non-Jewish baby. The answer is, I'll spare you the trouble of having to read it. The answer is yes. They rule that yes, it is permissible. Now, you would think that the government would charge these people with incitement to murder. But no. Weinstein, 2 days after the pogrom, he ruled that there will be no charges against them because they didn't specify. They didn't say Palestinians and Palestinian babies should be killed. They said non-Jews may be killed, non-Jewish babies. And because they weren't specific enough, they only referred to all non-Jews, therefore they would not be prosecuted. So in weeks that followed, you had 6 ambassadors from different African nations posted in Israel pleading with the foreign ministry, listen, we are being our wives can't go anywhere. We can't walk out into the street without being accosted and attacked. The fear on the streets, I mean, it's palpable. We can't walk anywhere without being the victims of racist hatred incited by leading members of the government, you have to put an end to this. So even those Africans with the most amount of privileges are feeling the heat. And the government then begins its policy. It now starts the deportations. This is when it begins the deportations. And the first people to go are those from South Sudan. South Sudan was a newly created state in mid-2012. And so the government said, now you're free, you've got your own country, you can go home. Of course, human rights activists were warning, it may be a sovereign nation, but there's still 50% of the people in it that don't even have access to clean drinking water. Of course, this didn't matter to the government, and it began deporting. Within a week and a half, you already had children who were born in Israel, who spoke Hebrew, who knew no other country but Israel, now deported to Sudan. Within 10 days, they're already dying from diseases that easily could have been treated in an Israeli hospital. Now remember I told you about that kindergarten that was firebombed. Well, by the end of the year, the man who established the kindergarten, who ran so that young children would have a place to go, he was deported by the government. And the same month, the man who firebombed the African kindergarten, he was let off by the courts and served no jail time whatsoever. So we're now at the end of 2012, and the government has built a fence, a high-tech fence along the border between Egypt and Israel, so that no more African asylum seekers will be able to easily cross over. Until that point, the border was not demarcated very intensively with any physical barrier. So now this fence runs the length of the border. Benjamin Netanyahu comes out there, announces this is the end of African migration. We've succeeded in building this barrier. Of course, he didn't mention that many of the men who worked on creating the fence were actually Africans themselves, working for a pittance. What you gonna do? You need to make a living. End of 2012. Newspaper headlines. 80-year-old Israeli woman raped by an African man. Of course, it brings out in people all of the anger and all the hatred, and people flood the streets demanding that all the Africans be deported from the country immediately. Now, what's interesting is that exactly 100 years previous, in 1913, there was a similar case right here in the United States of America, with this man, a Jew by the name of Leo Frank. He owned and operated a factory, and a young girl who was working for him was raped and murdered. He was accused of raping and murdering her. If he did it, we'll never know, because there's a lynch mob that broke into the jail, tied him up, and hung him. And on the basis of this occurrence, the Anti-Defamation League was formed, with the demand that never again we cannot allow people to be the victims of mob violence on the basis of their ethnic heritage. Of course, in the entire 100th year of its existence, celebrated last year in 2013, the ADL did not come up with one public statement criticizing the Israeli government as it rounded up African refugees and criminalized them and started to deport them and incite racial violence against them. Not once. And it's not just him. It was pretty much across the board. Ironically, because American Jewish leaders generally are in strong support of leniency towards migrants in this country, where they're a minority and can themselves benefit from increased tolerance for minorities. But in Israel, where Jews are the majority, they haven't said one word, and they silently support this effort to remove non-Jews from the country. I'm going to fast forward a little bit, but just so you see, this is the amount we're talking about. It's less than 1% of the population. That's what's so threatening. New election cycle, Netanyahu running for prime minister once again, and now campaigning on the basis of having stopped the African migration. There are no new Africans entering the country. The number has been capped. There's only 55,000. and it won't increase. And sure enough, on the basis of this campaign, he returns to power, but it's not only at the national stage where this issue becomes a focus. Even locally, people campaign on the basis of it. Imagine if you were walking down the street and you saw a poster like this: "To keep those Jews far from my daughter, I'm voting for the Christian Identity Party." This is a fictitious sign I invented in Photoshop, but this is a real sign, a campaign poster in the city of Hadera, and it's exactly word for word the exact same content. The person who ran on the basis of it got into power, and the newspaper, the first week afterwards, wondered aloud on the front page, did they get in because of their anti-Arab policies or because of their anti-African stance? And this wasn't just in the periphery, even in the heart of this supposed bastion of liberalism in Tel Aviv. I couldn't go more than 50 meters in any direction outside my apartment without seeing this poster, which again I've translated for you into English for those who don't read Hebrew. Again, anti-miscegenation messages. And with all these messages, I began to feel that I needed to understand where this is all coming from, and I needed to create a safe space. Here, graffiti, kick out the N-word everywhere you go. And so I moved down to Dimona, where there is actually a community of African people who have lived there, actually African Americans who moved to Israel starting over 40 years ago, and have a community of several thousand people. And I thought, moving down there, maybe there'll be some kind of safe space where I won't have to experience so much racism. But after a short period of time, I realized that the same racism had followed me there. And this is graffiti, literally 2 minutes walk from my house. "We hate the N-word." You're referring to let's do that in question answer period. Mm-hmm. And still till this day, many people in this community do not have status, do not have the right to work, do not have health care. Like my friend Dalia, just had a baby, can't get health care for the baby boy. Because why? She doesn't have J-positive blood. That's the only reason. She was born in Israel. She speaks perfect Hebrew. In every sense of the word, she's Israeli, but because she's not blue Jewish, she doesn't have access. So I started going through the archives of the Israeli government, and I realized that the same hatred directed towards this crop of African immigrants was directed towards the Africans that had immigrated from America 40, 30, 20 years ago, exactly one-to-one. Even though this group is 55,000, this group was only 1,500 at the beginning. The same hatred was directed towards them. I'm just going to quickly go through these. And even though the government official Knesset researcher discovered that the crime rate of Africans was actually lower than the crime rate of native Israelis, quickly he was sacked from his position and the report was buried and never heard from since. So a lot of parallels between what happened then and what's happening now. United States government now issuing a report saying that the treatment of Africans in Israel is a most significant human rights problem. The woman who called the Africans cancer, now elevated to the position of head of the Interior Committee in charge of the policy of what happens to Africans. Government reports being issued advising the government to concentrate the African migrants. Supreme Court rules it's unconstitutional and that the government needs to release them. The government ignores the report and continues, just creates another loophole, insisting that it will now round Africans up off the streets of Tel Aviv into these desert detention centers, and eventually starts to deport them on July 15th, 2013, which it was 75 years to the day after the Evian conference, when the nations of the world refused to accept Jewish refugees trying to flee Nazi Germany. 75 years later to the day, Israel begins its deportation of Eritreans and Sudanese back to Africa, back to what they fled from. Of course, the UN representative calling it the greatest violation possible of the Refugee Convention Israel has signed, a crime never before committed. I'm going to just run quickly through this because I want to be respectful of your time, but just to say that in recent months you have African people protesting in the streets, realizing that Israel is in its endgame, that now it's moving forward faster than ever to implement this policy to rid the country of non-Jewish Africans, rounding them into these desert camps. And it's inspiring to see people stand up for their rights and demand freedom and demand their refugee rights, and that their claims be that the government look at their claims and examine them and grant them the rights that they deserve. But sadly, Netanyahu's heart is hardened, and the people have not found fit to sympathize. And no matter how much they protest and how much they go on strike, and it's quite impressive to see 30,000 people on strike and in front of the U.S. consulate, in front of the Canadian embassy, and in front of the African Union and the UN. It doesn't seem to matter. The government is adamant in its policy, and the people also are not unwilling to allow these people to say 80% of people want them either rounded up or into jail or kicked out of the country altogether. So the last thing that I'll say before we go is that this policy can only be possible because the government differentiates between Jewish and non-Jewish people. And the demand that's being made of Palestinians and of all kinds of governments all over the world is that Israel's status as a Jewish nation be acknowledged, and that Israel be given the right to pursue its practices of Jewish privilege, of granting privileges to its Jewish citizens and stripping non-Jewish residents of these same privileges. And so that's why, if there's anything to be learned from this, it's that this must be opposed adamantly. We cannot allow the international community to agree for Israel to be acknowledged as the Jewish state, as if the United States should be granted the right to be acknowledged as a white Christian state. Because if this can happen in a state without having that legitimacy, imagine what happens once the world acknowledges and Palestinians acknowledge that Israel is the Jewish state, because then it will just feel free to run rampant over any semblance of human rights. And we have to, if there's one thing we have to take from this, it's that we have to stand in opposition to this demand. And I'm happy to answer any of your questions about this topic. Thanks for listening, and thanks for caring.
I really appreciate your excellent translation of the situation by showing what it would mean if in the United States we had the same thing. I wish that could be done with the Palestinian side as well. But there are, 20% of the population in Israel are Arabs. And I understand that they identify with the Palestinians. How do they relate, to the Africans? It would seem like they would be sympathetic or supportive, and they're in Knesset and so on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's a mixed bag. On one hand, you have to realize that historically, a lot of the blue-collar jobs in Israel were taken by Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel. So in some ways, the introduction of a new labor force that has even less rights and less legal protection undercuts their ability and takes away jobs from. So there is some tension around that issue. And of course, historically, racism is an issue that affects many communities, including Arab communities. And so there is underlying racism in the Palestinian community towards dark-skinned people, including dark-skinned Palestinians. At the same time, there are activists who are making the connections and realizing that both groups suffer from the same Zionist policy of giving privileges to Jewish people over non-Jewish people. On the ground, people often are just struggling to get through the day, and there hasn't been yet some real crossover in terms of uniting forces. would that happen in the future? I'm not certain, but potentially.
Let's go with the lady over here, and then we'll come to this side of the room as well.
Hi, I'm Jin Suk Lee from Korea. Thank you for your presentation. It looks like a historical irony. During the Second World War, it was the Jewish people who were discriminated against, but now, I mean, it is the Jewish people who discriminate the African people in the state of Israel. First of all, I would like to ask you what motivated you to voice out about this story. I know it is a journalist's job. And also, you are doing what the state of Israel probably does hate. So have you ever been threatened by the Israeli government?
So in answer to, remind me again, the first question was? What motivated me, right. Well, my whole life, I have been incensed, my whole adult life, I've been incensed by racism. And, to me, I feel like I also struggle against all forms of discrimination and other forms of oppression, whether it's people who are impoverished because of disaster capitalism, or people discriminated against because they're the indigenous residents of the land, or because they are new immigrants. And that's me. But the reason that I so focused on this issue over the last few years was because it felt like no one was doing so. I wouldn't have devoted so much of my time and energy to focusing if I felt that anyone else was doing so. I would have diverted my attentions elsewhere, but it was just no one was documenting this stuff. And it was so scandalous. I was just, if no one's doing it, someone's got to. And that's why I began to give it so much of my own attention. And in terms of the Israeli government, I guess I'm just not even, look, most people haven't even heard of this issue. So all my efforts to inform people about it, for most people it's not even on their radar. I'm just a fly that can be, it's not important enough, I guess, for the Israeli government to challenge me. Yeah, I am, if people read Max Blumenthal's book Goliath, I am discussed in that book. Yeah. So, but I haven't faced any direct problems from the government yet.
So it's great to see a lot of different hands up, and in the interest of time and accommodating as many as possible, I'm going to ask that we go around the room with the microphone, take as many questions as we can, and then try to have David respond to as many of them as possible. Okay. So did we have a hand up over here? I don't want to miss anyone on this side. Okay. So we'll start over here, lady that's been waiting right in the middle, and then we'll move around as well over to the side and back to the side.
Thank you. I want to also raise the gratitude probably of the audience for your taking on this issue and for naming this racism, which is an accusation which you often cannot raise in this society, because people who have been victimized by racism are not supposed to be able to be capable of racism. So who have historically been victimized by racism, I'd like you to comment about that. But I also wanted to make a comment. My husband and I are from the Sudan Studies Association, so we have a special interest. And we know, having observed this relationship for quite some time, it might be valuable to point out that the Israeli government was supporting the independence movement of South Sudan. And it was a strong supporter, material supporter as well as political supporter. And this is, you could call it a case of hypocrisy, or of when the refugees, come to a place of succor, they don't receive the support they had intended. So if people wonder why Southern Sudanese are going to Israel, it's not just a random choice.
Good afternoon. My name is Asantua Nkrumah Toure. I first want to thank you for your presentation. It's very timely because the pastor of my church just got back from Palestine and is doing a program to report back on his trip later this evening. So this is great timing. I'm wondering two quick things. Israel's latest, Miss Israel is an Ethiopian sister, right?
It's true.
Has she faced any of this kind of discrimination or racism or whatever, because I think it's very problematic that they're toting her around in the United States, and yet she and her people are going through this. That's very problematic and some obvious reasons. Also, AIPAC's annual conference is coming up here in DC, and they're stepping up their efforts to recruit the African people in this country, particularly the historic black church, by going to our churches, taking our youth to Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and even lobbying the Congressional Black Caucus. So I'm wondering, to your knowledge, does the Congressional Black Caucus and these black churches, do they know about this, or what's going on with that?
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's try to get a response first to those, because I know
Okay.
there's a lot there.
Okay.
So, and then
Okay.
we'll move on.
Okay, excellent. In regards to Israel's relationship with the African continent, it's very true what you said, that not only did it support the separationist movement in South Sudan, but Israel's government and Israeli arms manufacturers have been selling weapons and weapons training to many African nations for decades, including to Rwanda and militias during the war and the genocides that went on there. And in fact, that's why I brought up this slide where Israeli activists put up a poster saying in Hebrew, Israel sells weapons to the murderers and kicks out the victims. Because Israel has played a role in the creation of the refugee problem. It's not the sole actor, but it definitely played a role in the creation of the refugee problem in Africa. So yeah, certainly it has even more of a responsibility to be welcoming to asylum seekers. In terms of the blackwashing, which is what we call efforts by the Israeli government to appropriate the voices of people of color in order to deflect criticism that its policies are racist. The sister who is now the Miss Israel, I would argue that she was picked solely for that reason. In all of Israel's history, there's never been an Ethiopian. Why only now is there an Ethiopian Miss Israel? At the exact same moment that the country is trying to ethnically cleanse this African population. She's been brought around by the government, and right now, as we speak, around the United States, and she's giving interviews in which she says, these people are rapists, and I don't feel safe walking around, and none of them are refugees, they're all economic migrants. So she's just parroting the government's line. And that's sad, pitting Jewish African against non-Jewish African. It's one of the more, you asked earlier about Palestinians, in some ways it's sadder that although there are some Ethiopian Israeli activists who are in solidarity, oftentimes, unfortunately, it's not the case, just the opposite. We know about this pigmentocracy. It exists also here in other communities of color where, people are like, oh, lighter than thou, and, it gets the cans kicked down. So sadly, the Jews with the least amount of privilege in Jewish society are sadly often supremacist towards the non-Jews based on what little privilege they have in the society, their Jewishness. So unfortunately, yes, it's a huge campaign to recruit black voices and bribe them entice them with trips to Israel. And sadly, they're distorting the narrative of what's really happening and covering up for the crimes.
But do you know anything about, does the Congressional Black Caucus know this is happening, to your knowledge?
I always try to tweet out, I'm making an effort to report, but I'm not then chasing down the Congressional Caucus. But I have to believe that there's people, and I see it sometimes because on Twitter, that people can add your name, so kind of CC, carbon copy you. So I see people are trying to inform their members of Congress and other legislators, whether they're black mayors and black congressmen and congresswomen. I've never seen a response from any official who's a person of color said, oh, I'm interested to learn more. Wow, I'm scandalized by this. And I'm certain that there are efforts to make this known to them.
Thank you to the center again, and thank you, David, for your talk. I have a question, but a short comment before. I think that the situation of the Palestinians in Israel, the only way to judge their attitude towards what is happening with the Africans would be if they had their country. That would be the way to judge their attitude. On the other hand, I find it very paradoxical that two of the countries in the world that present themselves as the paladins of democracy, Israel and the United States, are committing these atrocious racist sins. Of course, the US being the country where the discrimination against the blacks has been historically the worst of the worst in the world. It became legal. And the South Africans copied the system from the United States. And I find it paradoxical that Israel is doing something similar. I think there is a deep communication between both societies here, both establishments, because it is outrageous. In addition, you described like 85% of what you described can be applied to the 12 million undocumented workers that were displaced by neoliberalism to come to survive to the United States with the criminalization, the persecution, the division of families, and it is happening now. But I can tell you that as an activist, I will definitely include this issue in all my activities. Now the question is, what has been the reaction of the US society, not only the government also, but in general, about this situation?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks. More questions? Or?
Yeah, let's take a question over here, and we'll close here. So if you could keep your questions brief and to the point so that we can get them all in. I know we're over time. So right here, and then we'll come here and here.
Yeah, I just also want to thank you very much for your presentation. And I wanted to say, in addition to what Asantua said, you know, I've been supporting Palestinian rights for a long time, and I go to various programs at the Jewish Community Center because I really want to understand what people are being told, and there are just patterns I observe. And besides the outreach that's being done to African American church members, I mean, there's a whole kind of there are all these cultural programs where African artists and playwrights and dancers and so on and so forth are given opportunities and to put on presentations, and they kind of touch, theoretically they're about racial issues here, but they really pull their punches tremendously. They never get into any depth of anti-imperialist understanding that would really give people a clue where to go forward. But they're, you know, I mean, it's very, very insidious way of kind of keeping people divided. And right now I'm working on a community radio station support group, Pacifica Network.
We need to get to the question.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, okay, I'm sorry, that essentially they have gotten rid of the powers that be, almost all of the African American programmers who would ever address these kinds of issues. And it just keeps going on and on, but they will replace them with much more moderate African American voices. So it's very hard to get the word out there, because if you do, you're a terrorist. So I don't know how to resolve it, but it's a really ongoing and very silent campaign. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Well, why don't we go right here, and then the gentleman's been waiting patiently in the back as well. So let's just try to keep the questions brief.
Yes, I really don't have a question. I wanted to give you something that we're getting ready to do, and it's regarding the public need to know what's going on in Washington, D.C., what's going on in Israel, and that's what we're getting ready to do. And when he read that, what I just gave him, he will understand. And
okay, thank you.
Star, thank you for being here. She's with you, Star, right? Oh, yeah, are you? Yeah, she's with the same radio station that I work with, cool. WPFW, and we're going to put this on. We're going to get this out there, and just read that and give me and please give me a call. My number and email address, everything's cool. On there. One thing I want to say, as far as whether the Black Caucus do anything. No politician can afford to represent the people that vote them in office, because the people that vote them in office cannot afford to give them the money needed to remain in office. All politicians are literally being held hostage due to the high cost of running for public office. So until we the people demand public funding, term limits, and mandatory voting laws for everybody between the age of 18 and 70, we're going to always have the best government money can buy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll close right back here with the final question as well. We'll get David to respond.
Sure. It's the last out there.
Thank you, Mr. David, for your presentation. My name is Yusri Odi. I'm from Palestine. I'm just curious to know how is it the situation for the refugee if they get married to Israeli citizen. Is it easy to get their papers and documentation there, comparing with it with the case here in United States or any state? Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. So I'll go in reverse order. I'll respond first to your question. The answer is that it's actually impossible. And the reason why is because in Israel, marriage law is governed by the ultra-Orthodox parties and rabbis that I spoke of earlier. As such, there's no provision. All marriage is religious. So someone who was born into a Jewish family cannot marry someone who is born into a Muslim or a Christian or a pagan family. It's not possible. Now, if you have money, then you can fly to some other country and get married there under their laws and then come back. But if you're a refugee, you can't leave the country because then they won't let you back in. So there's actually no way. Even if asylum, and it happens, there are couples, African man with an Israeli woman, Israeli man with an African woman, it happens, but they can't get married in the country and they can't leave the country to get married. And even if this African partner wanted to convert, let's say, for the sake of having the same culture or religion and being allowed to be married under law, these African partners agree and are willing to convert to Judaism. Even then, the government does not permit any of the Africans to convert to Judaism. 0%. So there are people who have attempted this, and the answer is they can't. And as such, people just being married or being partnered or even having a child with an Israeli isn't enough to keep you there. You can be deported even if you already have a family, and they'll split up a family. In answer to the question about the media and the American people, you may have heard the New York Times solicited a video from myself and Max Blumenthal about this very topic. They'd heard that we were reporting on it, asked us to make a video. We made a 10-minute video that summarizes the issue based on my own reporting and my own videos. And once they saw the final product, they were so scandalized that they said, no, we can't run this. And that really was depressing for me to realize that even the New York Times wasn't willing to put out this story, that it was censoring it, that it was being censored. And even BET, supposedly... Yeah, they can be. Yeah. So they're also censoring, and it's been very frustrating. Yeah, exactly. We know who owns BT, and so as a result, it's been very frustrating for me that American media has essentially ignored this issue all this time, even though it should have been, considering the amount of money that goes towards supporting the Israeli military and the Israeli government. You would have thought that something so scandalous as what I've shown you thus far would be a major news item. But it's been completely papered over, despite my best efforts to translate all this stuff so it would be easily accessible. I don't need the glory, I don't need the fame or the money from it. I'm happy if people just sample the work and all of the documentation that I've made. They can just sample the videos and use it in their own productions, even without me seeing any credit from it. But even that they haven't done. They haven't found it newsworthy enough to report on. So that's, without American news agencies reporting on it, the American people are left in the dark. And even if they would be, I don't know if they'd be scandalized, I would hope that they'd be scandalized, but even if they would be, there's no way that they'd know. So I can't end on a more positive note. But
thank you all very much, and thank you, David.